Hello and welcome to this CodeRage 2019 mini-series on Hit the Ground Running with the Ready-Made RAD Server. My name is Mannarino and I'm one of the Embarcadero software consultants. In this CodeRage mini-session, we will look at using RAD Server for building backends. We will learn how to add custom REST API resources through a Delphi or C++ Builder package library that gets loaded into RAD Server at startup. We will see how to use the new database endpoints wizard that will allow us to select a Fire DAC connection that displays the available tables, and by selecting a table we expose the access to the table. We'll look at using the new EMS dataset resource component. This new EMS dataset resource component allows for greater control of the data retrieved by desktop, multi-device web, and other service-based applications that connect to your RAD server application. We'll see how to use the REST resource dataset adapter component to parse the return JSON data, and we'll see how to nicely display the data on a list view component using the item appearance equals custom option that will allow us to toggle between design and edit modes to customize the list view on a multi-device or VCL client application. And lastly, we'll see how to create VCL and or multi-device RAD server EMS client applications to connect to the RAD server and call RAD server endpoints. Delphi and C++ Builder backend technologies. With Delphi and or C++ Builder, you have different choices for backend technologies to build scalable, fault-tolerant backends on premises or in the cloud. Your three main backend technology choices using Delphi and or C++ Builder are WebBroker, DataSnap, or RAD Server. But unlike DataSnap or WebBroker, RAD Server is pre-built and has out-of-the-box functionality typical for other backend as-a-service products. This session will focus on how to use RAD Server to build a multi-tier solution from the ground up. Let's now look at a demonstration on how to do this. Here I'm using the current RAD Studio 10.3.3. So when you open the New Items dialog for both Delphi and C++ Builder, you have a RAD Server package wizard. And this RAD Server package wizard is used to extend the functionality of the RAD Server. So we will click OK to use the RAD Server package wizard. On the first page of the wizard, we have an option to create either an empty package or create a package with a resource. So we will select Create Package with Resource. In general, in a single package, there could be multiple resources. They can be added using the RAD Server module wizard that is available in the RAD Server category when a RAD Server package project is opened in the IDE. Click Next. Now here on the second page of the wizard, we need to specify the resource name and the base class for the resource implementation. Now if we plan to add any components to a resource, then it is a good idea to choose Data Module. Otherwise, you can just select Unit. For our RAD Server package, we want to connect to an interbase database and get data from the customer table. So for us, we will select the data module and we will call our resource name customer data. Click Next. On this page of the wizard, we can specify which endpoints we want to add to the resource. So these sample endpoints will translate to different HTTP request types and URLs. But in our case, we are going to deselect the sample endpoints because we will be using the new database endpoints option, and this database endpoints option will allow us to select a Fire DAC connection that displays the available tables, and by selecting a table we will expose the access to the table. Click Next. Here on this last page of the wizard, since we selected the database endpoint options, we get to select our Fire DAC connection to our database. So for this example, we will be using the interbase employee database, and after we connect to the employee database, we can select the customer table we want to use for our customer data. and click Finish. So here we see the RAD Server Package Wizard generates for us the complete project. I clicked on Save All, and I'm going to save our new project in a new folder called CodeRage 2019 RAD Server, and I'm going to accept all the default names for the new units. So Unit 2, save. Instead of calling it Project 2, I'll call it my CodeRage 2019 RAD Server project and save. We see that the project is a .bpl package file, so it's a runtime package. So this file is a DLL on Windows platforms with special RAD Studio specific features. Looking into the code, we see we have a resource name equal to customer data, and we have a T customer data resource. That's a data module. On the data module, we have our FireDAC connection to the employee database, and we have our FireDAC query component to the customer table. And looking into the FireDAC query component for customer, we see we have SQL that says select star from customer. So let's modify this SQL to order the list of returned customers. So instead of select star from customers, we'll say select star from customers, order by customer. And when we execute this query, we see now that the customers get returned in alphabetical order. So that's nice. Also on the data module, we have our T EMS dataset resource component. This new T EMS dataset resource dataset mapping component allows you to map your endpoints to the new T EMS dataset resource component and not to methods that you would need to write yourself. So this component has an allowed actions property that controls which endpoints we want to add to the resource. And these endpoints will translate to different HTTP request types and URLs. So if we select all of them, then we have all 5 different CRUD-L operations to expose on our resource. But for our application, we only need to allow list and get. So we will remove post, put, and delete. So this will allow us to list all the customers from the customer table. Next, looking back into the code, we see we have a resource suffix equal to customer. Now by default, all class endpoints will get a resource suffix equal to the resource module field name. So here we see the name customer, but this may be overridden by specifying an attribute for the resource module field. So for example, we can use resource name to override the field name, or we can use resource suffix to override the resource suffix. Now a class endpoint may be marked with a resource suffix attribute, and when the suffix starts with a /, then the specified suffix will be appended to the default resource suffix of the resource module field. So for our RAD server module, we are going to replace this resource suffix customer. So instead of customer, we will add the /, like this. So now, when we start our RAD server and we call our customer data endpoint, we see that we get returned a JSON array of all of the customer data from the customer table like this. So that's very nice. So next, let's look at how to create a RAD server EMS client to connect to our RAD server, call the customer data endpoint, and display our list of customers on a list view component. In the project manager, we will right click on the project group and select add a new project. We will select a Delphi multi-device application, blank application. I went ahead and I saved our RAD server client as our RAD server client project. On our form I added a toolbar aligned to the top. On the toolbar, I added a button to get customer list. On the form, I added a list view component. And for the list view's item appearance, I have it set to custom. So by using list item appearance equal to custom, this allows us to toggle between design and edit mode to customize the list view. On the form, I added an EMS provider component, and I set the URL host and the URL port to where our RAD server is running. I added a backend endpoint component where the provider is our EMS provider and our resource is our customer data endpoint from RAD server to get to the customer data from our customer table. I added a REST response dataset adapter component where the response JSON is equal to the backend endpoint. So what's nice about this REST response dataset adapter component is when a REST service response is in JSON format, this REST response dataset adapter can parse the response content and transfer the data into a T dataset. So for this application, I added a FireDAC memory table to the application, and we're going to use this as the dataset for our JSON data. Now, getting back to the REST response dataset adapter, you may already be aware that not every JSON data can be transformed into a dataset structure. The parser is looking for a JSON object or an array of JSON objects. The parser looks for the collections of the key values of the JSON objects to create the dataset columns. Now, due to the nature of JSON data, the parser iterates through the whole response and collects information for the columns of the dataset. This way, the dataset is always complete. Now, the adapter is only for displaying data. To allow editing of the data and posting them back to the server, you need to create your own adapter. Now, using these components, let's look at the code we use to implement the button click to get customer list data from the customer table. So the first thing we will do is execute the customer data endpoint on RAD server by calling the execute method of the backend endpoint. Then we will clear the last JSON response value. Next, we will traverse into the nested JSON objects when scanning for fields. And then we can parse the JSON from the REST RAD server call. And lastly, we can provide the JSON value to the adapter. Now, at design time, we can right-click on the backend endpoint component and select execute. And by doing this, this will create the FireDAC memory table columns. So now if we bind visually, we see all of our columns from the customer table in our FireDAC memory table. And we see from our list view in custom mode that we have item text and item detail. So let's say for item detail, we want to set that to be equal to the value of customer, and that shows up on our list view at design time. And for our customer number from our customer table, we will set that to be equal to the item text value. So that's great. So now let's execute this RAD server client and click on the Get Customer List button and see if we can hit the RAD server, call the customer data endpoint, and return data back on our list view. So our RAD server is still running. I am going to start up our RAD server client application. So now when I click on the Get Customer List button, it calls the customer data endpoint, which returns back the JSON array of customer data that gets parsed with the REST response dataset adapter, and we display the customer and the customer number on our list view component. So all of that worked great. And if we look at the RAD server, we do get to see that the customer data endpoint was called. So all of that is working great. So that is all that is involved on how to use RAD Server to build a multi-tier solution from the ground up. So thank you all for attending this CodeRage 2019 mini session on how to use RAD Server to build a multi-tier solution from the ground up. Regards to all and have a great day.